I'd expected him to be a mechanic-type politician, a politician who goes through the motions about everything and is prepared to compromise his beliefs and is prepared to play games, and for whom winning the games is more important than what the games are about. But I found I was wrong about that there really was a genuine, for want of a better word, Labor soul there. And I then started to warm to him a bit, and then I met him several times over the election campaign itself and found that opinion confirmed, that he is a man of considerable substance. The problem is that, it so seldom comes out in his public appearances that he almost goes out of his way to portray himself as boring, possibly because he feels that, it worked for John Howard for 11 years.
Well, that has been one of the views, of course, of Kevin Rudd, that he is John Howard light, that he's John Howard modernised, if you like. But, I think in the essay you're really taking issue with what you call the commentariat. People like me, and in fact people like you, aren't you part of the commentariat? Anyway, those of us who see...
Not so much you and me, more the Canberra Press Gallery.
Those who see Kevin Rudd as the triumph of spin over substance.
Yes, and I think that this has really been the view that people have been trying to put forward, the Canberra Press Gallery in particular, have been trying to put forward for 3 years. There's been this extraordinary denial, if you like, among the Canberra Press Gallery that Rudd's appeal can be based on anything substantial. For 3 years, his popularity has been at stratospheric levels. The opinion polls keep saying that, he is by far the most preferred man to be Prime Minister in good times or bad. And yet the commentariat keeps saying, no, the public have got it all wrong. They don't understand this. He's all spin. He's no substance. It's just he's an obsessive controller of the media. He's got the public conned. And we had at one stage, actually in 2007, during the election campaign, we had people like Paul Kelly in The Australian, the resident professor, writing stuff about how, these people are living in a parallel universe. There are two realities here. There's the reality of the polls, the opinion polls, but there's the reality, the inside the beltway, whatever that is, reality, the inside the beltway reality which people like me control, which is that Rudd is not really popular at all. This was fantasy. This was the most extraordinary piece of bullshit that, has almost ever been perpetrated on the Australian public. And it's gone on and on and on. Like I say, 3 years later, the penny still has not dropped. Kevin Rudd is genuinely admired, liked, and thought of as a good leader by the vast majority of the Australian electorate. And yet we still have the commentariat saying, sooner or later they'll wake up, sooner or later they'll see the real Rudd. Well, just perhaps they have seen the real Rudd, and it's the commentariat who's living in that parallel universe.
Well, let me take the side of the commentariat for a moment and argue that, yes, Rudd is popular, and yes, he does manage the media very well, and what has he actually achieved in 2 years as Prime Minister?
Well, the one thing he has certainly achieved in 2 years as Prime Minister is that he has weathered the global financial crisis. He has got us through that particular episode probably in better shape than any country in the world. Now, okay, so again, the commentariats say, that was only because he had such a wonderful economy bequeathed to him by John Howard and Peter Costello, and yes, but, it wasn't really his doing at all. But in fact, you must say that it was a quite extraordinary achievement, given the way the rest of the world went into meltdown and the huge confusion that the collapse of the neoliberal free market system caused around the world. You would have thought that a relatively small economy such as Australia's would have been swept up in the maelstrom and never seen again. yet somehow we got through it okay. And this is the point I make at the beginning of the essay, that we were caught in this nightmare when the system collapsed. We'd seen the socialist system collapse earlier in the 1990s. That had been discredited. The whole idea of economic socialism had been discredited with the fall of the Soviets. And then suddenly the remaining code, the remaining ideology, free market capitalism, that seemed to collapse too. And suddenly we had nowhere to go at all. And the only man who was going to save us was this, boring, repetitive, God-bothering nerd who tapped us on the shoulder and said, "Hello, I'm Kevin, I'm from Queensland and I'm here to help." And he did. That was the whole point. He did. And it appears that we believed him. And it appears that he got us through it. Now, okay, I agree with Peter that there's not an awful lot else in terms of solid achievement to mark down. We haven't had the education revolution. We haven't ended the blame game. We haven't had the broadband system throughout Australia. These are all works in progress. But apparently, we still trust Kevin Rudd, possibly because of the triumph during the GFC, enough to believe that he will pursue these things and that he will sooner or later deliver.
I guess there's an opportunity cost involved here, an opportunity cost of $42 billion, which is the money that was spent on getting us through the GFC. And you talk about the education revolution. Well, it's hijacked the education revolution and turned it into a make-work scheme for the building industry. Lots more classrooms that schools don't necessarily need, rather than a fundamental look at what's wrong with state education. I mean, it put a lot of money through poker machines. It saw a lot of new flat-screen TVs bought. That was an awful lot of money at a time when we need to, we're told by Kevin Rudd himself, in order to meet the greatest moral challenge of our time, re-engineer the entire economy to a carbon-constrained future. Okay,
well, let's leave the carbon trading scheme out for the moment, because we're obviously going to talk a lot about that later. But I think you're exaggerating a bit. I mean, you say a lot of classrooms that schools don't need. Okay, there was a bit of misallocation of resources, there's no doubt about that. But there were also a hell of a lot of classrooms that schools do need. It wasn't all pissed up against a wall by any means at all. There has been, it did help rescue the building industry, and that helped solve a lot of the unemployment crisis which otherwise would have impinged on the economy as a whole. It's true that a lot of the spending stimulus, the first spending stimulus at least, did go through poker machines, and it did go into flat-screen TVs. But again, this was money that was recirculated in the Australian economy, which kept consumer confidence moving, and which again preserved a lot of jobs which would otherwise have been lost. And this to me is the key thing. The great imperative in Australian politics, I think since Federation and probably before, has been the idea of preserving employment. Almost every single aspect of the national settlement, of the whole ethos of Australian politics, when you analyse it carefully, has had at least preserving employment as one of its aims. And it does cost a lot of money, but that's what people expect. People expect governments to preserve jobs, and if it costs a lot of money, that's money well spent. And I don't think that the public, as opposed to the commentariat, begrudges the way that money was spent.
You go there to one of the fundamental thesis of the essay, which is that Rudd has managed to tap into various myths and traditions in Australia. And you mentioned one there, the Australian settlement at Federation, a minimum wage, arbitration and conciliation, and the idea of a decent job for all, that being a primary kind of role of government. And so what you're saying is through the GFC, Rudd has reached back to that deeply embedded idea?
I believe so. I think that Rudd has managed to convince people that he is sincere about that hugely important central thesis of Australia. And by doing that, he's won over a lot of his critics. I mean, one of the things I mentioned in the essay is at some stage earlier this year, there was a letter writer to the Sydney Morning Herald who was replying to some particularly silly article about why Rudd shouldn't be as popular as he was. And she said, OK, the reason for Rudd's popularity can be summed up in one word: integrity. And I think that integrity, that sense of purpose, that sense of a genuine core belief in the old traditions of Australia is one of the things that sustains Rudd. See, when Howard talked about mateship, we all knew it was bullshit. It was just a word. You can't have mateship if you are deliberately setting one side of society against another, if you are deliberately taking the view that we shouldn't have egalitarianism, instead of that we should have choice. But Rudd does come back to that core understanding. He doesn't do it, with great ostentation. He doesn't do it in a missionary preaching style. But I think people see that what he is trying to do and what he stands for is in that tradition, and that there's something deeply appealing and deeply comforting, if you like, about that. And that's why people will continue to go with Rudd even when he's boring them shitless.
Where is the evidence for that argument in policy terms, though? Because, you talk about how it's promotion of choice rather than egalitarianism, and the obvious examples there are massive support for the private education system and for private health insurance. Now, Kevin Rudd hasn't changed any of that and doesn't show any indication of doing so.
Well, I don't think it's fair to say he doesn't show any indication of doing so. He did say very firmly that he wouldn't change any of that in his first term. That was an election promise, and Rudd, as we all know, has a great places great importance on keeping his election promises. He's seen how much the idea of non-core promises hurt Howard, and he wants to preserve this idea of his integrity. He made that promise, he's going to keep it. But I'll bet you any money you like, come the second term, you'll find that absurd education policy and private schools funding policy will change, and I'll bet, and he has already tried to at least partially dismantle the health subsidy to private funds policy, but hasn't been able to get it through the Senate. So I don't think it's fair to say that Rudd isn't trying. The signals are all there, but Rudd is determined that he's not going to make the mistake that some of his predecessors made of trying to do too much too fast and frightening the horses too much. The two great innovative Labor leaders of the last 30 years have, of course, been Gough Whitlam and Paul Keating, and neither of them lasted more than 3 years. Rudd wants to stay in for the long term, so he really can remodel the society and make it a better and more interesting society. Because of his election promises domestically, he's felt himself constrained in that domestic area. But look how much he's done overseas, how much he's opened up the Australian international influence and perception in the time he's been there. Rudd's work simply getting the G20 into operation, to me, is more than enough justification for his first term.
Because you argue, and again this is a key point in the essay, you argue that the work on the G20 has actually been fundamental to dealing with the global financial crisis at a global level.
Yes, but the benefits of the G20 becoming an active global force in more than just a talk shop about economic issues are absolutely immense. The United Nations is hopeless. The United Nations is so unwieldy, so packed with bureaucrats and time servers and so on, that there's nothing much can be done with it. The predecessor of the G20, the G7 and the G8, were simply rich man's clubs that represented nobody. The G20 represents directly 2/3 of the world's population and indirectly most of the rest. I mean, this is a true democratisation of the way of the world order, if you like, in a way that we just haven't seen. I mean, and Rudd was very instrumental in bringing that about. I mean, that'll do me sport.
Well, let's turn to another of the myths that, or the kind of ideas about Australia that Rudd has revived, and this one is in the title, Kevin Rudd and the Lucky Country. And in a way, it's kind of contradictory here, because what you're saying is that Kevin Rudd has tapped into our belief in the lucky country, and we're not talking Donald Horne irony here, we're talking the idea that this is God's own chosen land and we are somehow blessed.
Well, yes, because I think that again is one of the great Australian myths. I mean, we have always felt ourselves to be something pretty close to utopia. We've always had this idea that Australia is somehow better, somehow different. I mean, there have been all sorts of nonsense tied up with this. I mean, we can beat everybody at sport, you know, our soldiers are the bravest in the world, so on, so on, so on. But there has always been this feeling that somehow Australia is designed to be the best place on earth. It has the potential to be the best place on earth. All we've got to do is work a bit harder at it. And I think Rudd has revived that a bit. Howard tended to undersell us. Howard was always talking about how, oh, we're only a smaller country, we're only a middle-sized economy. He was always kowtowing to our great and powerful friends. Rudd has revived the idea that there is something special about Australia, that there is something unique about it. Now, I'm not arguing whether this is true or false, but I'm saying that Rudd has been able to bring this idea back to fruition, that we are really a lucky country. He's restored our self-belief in that in a way which Howard had never sought to do. And I think, again, this is part of his appeal, that he's worked through that old myth that we are somehow specially blessed. Don't ask me how, but somehow we are. And that this is a bloody good thing and we should rejoice in it.
Well, he's also been able to do it without denying our history and the blemishes, as you might call them, or as other people have called them, without playing down. I mean, we had the apology. He has acknowledged that our history is not so great.
Exactly, and I think this is very important. I mean, Howard always said we don't have to choose between our history and our geography. But in fact, Howard made the choice every time. We chose our history, and we chose a very selective view of our history, the pioneers, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, blah, blah, blah. Rudd has decided that we're going to be wider than that we don't have to deny the bad things in our past, and that we can spread ourselves wider. We don't simply have to say that we're an Anglo-Saxon island in the middle of Asia, and while we're prepared to trade with the bastards, we don't want them to marry our daughters. We are now talking much more about the reality of Australia in a global situation, and Australia as a true migrant country, and so on. And I think, again, that has made us feel a lot more comfortable. I mean, for my money, Rudd hasn't been a disappointment on the whole in Aboriginal affairs. He hasn't done nearly as much as he should. But at least he's pointing in the right direction. And at least he has set himself measurable targets. And if he doesn't meet them, okay, he's going to have to answer for that. Howard never did that, and in fact very few Prime Ministers in the past have. And again, this to me is something of a breakthrough. It's a good reason to believe that Rudd has more substance to him than many people believe.
In looking at our history, you identify a number of contradictions, ambiguities perhaps in the Australian character. I mean, you point out that we like to see ourselves as larrikins and rebels, but there are actually incredibly law-abiding type of people. You know, we wear our seatbelts and we don't smoke inside, and, you know, we actually observe rules.